History of Iceland. Published December the 9th, 2017. Special characters are denoted as follows. And. Left and right parentheses. A bullet point. An M dash. The recorded history of Iceland began with the settlement by Viking explorers and their slaves from the east, particularly Norway and the British Isles, in the late 9th century. Iceland was still uninhabited long after the rest of Western Europe had been settled. Recorded settlement has conventionally been dated back to 874, although archaeological evidence indicates Gallic monks had settled Iceland before that date. The land was settled quickly, mainly by Norwegians who may have been fleeing conflict or seeking new land to farm. By 930, the chieftains had established a form of governance, the Althing, making it one of the world's oldest parliaments. Towards the end of the 10th century, Christianity came to Iceland through the influence of the Norwegian king Ólafur Tryggvason. During this time Iceland remained independent, a period known as the Old Commonwealth, and Icelandic historians began to document the nation's history in books referred to as sagas of Icelanders. In the early 13th century, the internal conflict known as the Age of the Sturlungs weakened Iceland, which eventually became subjugated to Norway through the Old Covenant. 1262 to 1264. Effectively ending the Commonwealth. Norway, in turn, was united with Sweden. 1319. And then Denmark. 1376. Eventually all of the Nordic states were united in one alliance, the Kalmar Union. 1397 to 1523. But on its dissolution, Iceland fell under Danish rule. The subsequent strict Danish-Icelandic trade monopoly in the 17th and 18th centuries was detrimental to the economy. Iceland's subsequent poverty was aggravated by severe natural disasters like the Mofurfindin or mist hardships. During this time the population declined. Iceland remained part of Denmark, but in keeping with the rise of nationalism around Europe in the 19th century, an independence movement emerged. The Althing, which had been suspended in 1799, was restored in 1844, and Iceland gained sovereignty after World War I, on the 1st of December 1918. However, Iceland shared the Danish monarchy until World War II. Although Iceland was neutral in the Second World War, the United Kingdom peacefully occupied it in 1940 to forestall a Nazi occupation, after Denmark was overrun by the German Wehrmacht. Because of the island's strategic position in the North Atlantic, the Allies occupied the island until the end of the war, the United States taking over occupation duties from the British in 1941. In 1944, Iceland severed its remaining ties with Denmark, then still under Nazi occupation, and declared itself a fully independent nation. Following the Second World War, Iceland was a founding member of both the United Nations and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Its economy grew rapidly largely through fishing, although this was marred by disputes with other nations. Following rapid financial growth, the 2008-11 Icelandic financial crisis occurred. Iceland continues to remain outside the European Union. Because of its remoteness, Iceland has been spared the ravages of European wars but has been affected by other external events, such as the Black Death and the Protestant Reformation imposed by Denmark. Iceland's history has also been marked by a number of natural disasters. Iceland is a relatively young country in the geological sense, being formed about 20 million years ago by a series of volcanic eruptions in the mid-Atlantic Ridge. The oldest stone specimens found in Iceland date back to circa 16 million years ago. Part 1. Geological background. In geological terms, Iceland is a young island. It started to form in the Miocene era about 20 million years ago from a series of volcanic eruptions on the mid-Atlantic Ridge, where it lies between the North American and Eurasian plates. These plates spread at a rate of approximately 2.5 centimeters per year. This elevated portion of the ridge is known as the Reykjavik Ridge. The volcanic activity is attributed to a hotspot, the Iceland hotspot, which in turn lies over a mantle plume. The Iceland Plume. An anomalously hot rock in the Earth's mantle which is likely to be partly responsible for the island's creation and continued existence. For comparison, it is estimated that other volcanic islands, such as the Faroe Islands, have existed for about 55 million years. The Azores, on the same ridge, about 8 million years, and Hawaii less than 1 million years. The younger rock strata in the southwest of Iceland and the Central Highlands are only about 700,000 years old. The geological history of the Earth is divided into ice ages, based on temperature and climate. The last glacial period, commonly referred to as the Ice Age, is thought to have been about 110,000 years ago and ended about 10,000 years ago. While covered in ice, Iceland's icefalls, fjords and valleys were formed. Part 2. Early History. Iceland remained, for a long time, one of the world's last larger islands uninhabited by humans, the others being New Zealand and Madagascar. It has been suggested that the land called Thule by the Greek merchant Pytheas, 4th century BC, was actually Iceland, although it seems highly unlikely considering Pytheas' description of it as an agricultural country with plenty of milk, honey, and fruit, probably Norway, or possibly the Faroe Islands or Shetland. The exact date that humans first reached the island is uncertain. Roman currency dating to the 3rd century has been found in Iceland, but it is unknown whether they were brought there at that time or came later with Vikings after circulating for centuries. There is some literary evidence that monks and the papa from a Hiberno-Scottish mission may have settled in Iceland before the arrival of the Norsemen. The 12th century scholar Arifo Rgilsson Fess Icelandingabok states that small bells, corresponding to those used by Irish monks, were found by the settlers. No such artifacts have been discovered by archaeologists, however. Some Icelanders claimed descent from Cherbal mac Dunlunge, king of Osrailgeon southeastern Ireland, at the time of the Landnámabók's creation. Part 3. Settlement. 874 to 930. Part 3. Settlement. Chapter 1. Irish monks. The Landnámabók mentions the presence of Irish monks. The Papa. Prior to Norse settlement, and states that the monks left behind Irish books, bells and crosiers, among other things. According to the same account, the Irish monks abandoned the country when the Norse arrived, or had left prior to their arrival. Another source mentioning the Papa is Icelandingabok, dating from between 1122 and 1133. According to this account, the previous inhabitants, a few Irish monks, known as the Papa, left the island since they did not want to live with pagan Norsemen. One theory suggests that those monks were members of a Hiberno-Scottish mission, Irish and Scottish monks who spread Christianity during the Middle Ages. They may also have been hermits. Recent archaeological excavations have revealed the ruins of a cabin in Hafnir on the Reykjanes Peninsula, close to Keflavik International Airport. Carbon dating reveals that the cabin was abandoned somewhere between 770 and 880, suggesting that Iceland was populated well before 874. This archaeological find may also indicate that the monks left Iceland before the Norse arrived. Part 3. Settlement. Chapter 2. Norse discovery. According to the Landnámabók, Iceland was discovered by Nadiod, one of the first settlers in the Faroe Islands, who was sailing from Norway to the Faroes but lost his way and drifted to the east coast of Iceland. Nadiod called the country Snealand, Snowland. Swedish sailor Georg Varvarsson also accidentally drifted to the coast of Iceland. He discovered that the country was an island and called it Georgshólmi, Georgfs Iceland, and stayed for the winter at Husavik. The first Norseman who deliberately sailed to Georgshólmi was Hafna Flokvilgefrson. Floki settled for one winter at Bafstrond. After the incredibly cold winter passed, the summer came and the whole island became green, which stunned Floki. Realizing that this place was in fact habitable, despite the horribly cold winter, and full of useful resources, Floki restocked his boat. He then returned east to Norway with resources and knowledge. Part 3, Settlement Chapter 3, First Settler. The first permanent settler in Iceland is usually considered to have been a Norwegian chieftain named Ólafur and his wife, Havigafaro. According to the Landnámabók, he threw 2 carved pillars overboard as he neared land, vowing to settle wherever they landed. He then sailed along the coast until the pillars were found in the southwestern peninsula, now known as Reykjavik. There he settled with his family around 874, in a place he named Reykjavik, Smoke Cove, probably from the geothermal steam rising from the earth. This place eventually became the capital and the largest city of modern Iceland. It is recognized, however, that Ingólfsson may not have been the first one to settle permanently in Iceland. That may have been Natfari, one of Georg Varvarsson's men who stayed behind when Georg returned to Scandinavia. Much of the above information comes from the Landnámabók, written some 3 centuries after the settlement. Archaeological findings in Reykjavik are consistent with the date given there. There was a settlement in Reykjavik around 870. Part 3, Settlement Chapter 4, Settlement. According to Landnámabók, Ingólf was followed by many more Norse chieftains, their families and slaves who settled all the habitable areas of the island in the next decades. Archaeological evidence strongly suggests that the timing is roughly accurate, that the whole country was occupied within a couple of decades towards the end of the 9th century. These people were primarily of Norwegian, Irish and Scottish origin. Some of the Irish and Scots were slaves and servants of the Norse chiefs, according to the sagas of Icelanders, the Landnámabók, and other documents. Some settlers coming from the British Isles were Hiberno Norse, with cultural and family connections both to the coastal and island areas of Ireland and/or Scotland and to Norway. The traditional explanation for the exodus from Norway is that people were fleeing the harsh rule of the Norwegian king Harald Fairhair, whom medieval literary sources credit with the unification of some parts of modern Norway during this period. It is also believed that the western fjords of Norway were simply overcrowded in this period. The settlement of Iceland is thoroughly recorded in the aforementioned Landnámabók, although the book was compiled in the early 12th century when at least 200 years had passed from the age of settlement. Reformation Icelandingabók is generally considered more reliable as a source and is probably somewhat older, but it is far less thorough. It does say that Iceland was fully settled within 60 years, which likely means that all arable land had been claimed by various settlers. Part 4, Commonwealth. 930-1262. In 930, the ruling chiefs established an assembly called the Alþingi. The parliament convened each summer at Þingvellir, where representative chieftains, Geofsmenn or Geofar, amended laws, settled disputes and appointed juries to judge lawsuits. Laws were not written down but were instead memorized by an elected law speaker. Alþingi. The Alþingi is sometimes stated to be the world's oldest existing parliament. Importantly, There was no central executive power, and therefore laws were enforced only by the people. This gave rise to feuds, which provided the writers of the sagas with plenty of material. Iceland enjoyed a mostly uninterrupted period of growth in its Commonwealth years. Settlements from that era have been found in southwest Greenland and eastern Canada, and sagas such as Saga of Eric the Red and Greenland Saga speak of the settlers' exploits. Part 4, Commonwealth Chapter 1, Christianization. The settlers of Iceland were predominantly pagans and worshipped the Norse gods, among them Odin, Thor, Freyr and Freyja. By the 10th century, political pressure from Europe to convert to Christianity mounted. As the end of the first millennium grew near, many prominent Icelanders had accepted the new faith. In the year 1000, as a civil war between the religious groups seemed likely, the Alfing appointed one of the chieftains, Thorgelos Vetningagodi, to decide the issue of religion by arbitration. He decided that the country should convert to Christianity as a whole, but that pagans would be allowed to worship privately. The first Icelandic bishop, Ísleifur Gissurarson, was consecrated by Bishop Adalbert of Hamburg in 1056. Part 4, Commonwealth Chapter 2, Civil War and the End of the Commonwealth. During the 11th and 12th centuries, the centralization of power had worn down the institutions of the Commonwealth, as the former notable independence of local farmers and chieftains gave way to the growing power of a handful of families and their leaders. The period from around 1200 to 1262 is generally known as Age of the Sturlungs. This refers to Sturluson and his sons, Sigvart Sturluson and Snorri Sturluson, who were one of two main clans fighting for power over Iceland, causing havoc in a land inhabited almost entirely by farmers who could ill afford to travel far from their farms across the island to fight for their leaders. In 1220, Snorri Sturluson became a vassal of Håkon IV of Norway. His nephew Sturla Sigvardsson also became a vassal in 1235. Sturla used the power and influence of the Sturlunga family clan to wage war against the other clans in Iceland. After decades of conflict, the Icelandic chieftains agreed to accept the sovereignty of Norway and signed the Old Covenant. Gamali Satmali, establishing a union with the Norwegian monarchy. Part 5, Iceland under Norwegian and Danish kings. 1262 to 1944. Part 5, Iceland under Norwegian and Danish kings. Chapter 1, Norwegian rule. Little changed in the decades following the treaty. Norway's consolidation of power in Iceland was slow, and the Althing intended to hold onto its legislative and judicial power. Nonetheless, the Christian clergy had unique opportunities to accumulate wealth via the tithe, and power gradually shifted to ecclesiastical authorities as Iceland's two bishops in Skálholt and Hólar acquired land at the expense of the old chieftains. Around the time Iceland became a vassal state of Norway, a climate shift occurred. A phenomenon now called the Little Ice Age. Areas near the Arctic Circle such as Iceland and Greenland began to have shorter growing seasons and colder winters. Since Iceland had marginal farmland in good times, the climate change resulted in hardship for the population. A serfdom-like institution called the Vistaband developed, in which peasants were bound to landowners for a year at a time. It became more difficult to raise barley, the primary cereal crop, and livestock required additional fodder to survive longer and colder winters. Icelanders began to trade for grain from continental Europe, which was an expensive proposition. Church fast days increased demand for dried codfish, which was easily caught and prepared for export, and the cod trade became an important part of the economy. Part 5, Iceland under Norwegian and Danish kings. Chapter 2, Danish rule. Iceland remained under Norwegian kingship until 1380, when the death of Olaf II of Denmark extinguished the Norwegian male royal line. Norway, and thus Iceland, then became part of the Kalmar Union, along with Sweden and Denmark, with Denmark as the dominant power. Unlike Norway, Denmark did not need Iceland's fish and homespun wool. This created a dramatic deficit in Iceland's trade. The small Greenland colony, established in the late 10th century, died out completely before 1500. With the introduction of absolute monarchy in Denmark-Norway in 1660 under Frederick II I of Denmark, the Icelanders relinquished their autonomy to the crown, including the right to initiate and consent to legislation. Denmark, however, did not provide much protection to Iceland. Citation needed, which was raided in 1627 by a Barbary pirate fleet that abducted almost 300 Icelanders into slavery, in an episode known as the Turkish Abductions. Part 5, Iceland under Norwegian and Danish Kings. Chapter 3, Foreign Merchants and Fishermen. English and German merchants became more prominent in Iceland at the start of the 15th century. Some historians refer to the 15th century as the English Age in Iceland's history, due to the prominence of English traders and fishing fleets. What drew foreigners to Iceland was primarily fishing in the fruitful waters off the coast of Iceland. The Icelandic trade was important to some British ports. For example, in Hull, the Icelandic trade accounted for more than 10% of Hull's total trade. The trade has been credited with raising Icelandic living standards. The 16th century has been referred to as the German Age by Icelandic historians due to the prominence of German traders. The Germans did not engage in much fishing themselves, but they owned fishing boats, rented them to Icelanders, and then bought the fish from Icelandic fishermen to export to the European continent. An illicit trade continued with foreigners after the Danes implemented a trade monopoly. Dutch and French traders became more prominent in the mid-17th century. Part 5, Iceland under Norwegian and Danish Kings. Chapter 4, Reformation and Danish Trade Monopoly. By the middle of the 16th century, Christian II I of Denmark began to impose Lutheranism on his subjects. John Arason and Egmunda Pálsson, the Catholic bishops of Skalholt and Hölle respectively, opposed Christians' efforts at promoting the Protestant Reformation in Iceland. Egmunda was deported by Danish officials in 1541, but John Arason put up a fight. Opposition to the Reformation ended in 1551. John Arason was captured after being defeated in the Battle of Saufell by loyalist forces under the leadership of Dafgufmundssson. John Arason and his two sons were subsequently beheaded in Skalholt. Following this, the Icelanders became Lutherans and remain largely so to this day. In 1602, Iceland was forbidden to trade with countries other than Denmark, by order of the Danish government, which at this time pursued mercantilist policies. The Danish-Icelandic trade monopoly remained in effect until 1786. Part 5, Iceland under Norwegian and Danish Kings. Chapter 5, The Eruption of Laki. In the 18th century, climatic conditions in Iceland reached an all-time low since the original settlement. On top of this, Laki erupted in 1783, spitting out 12.5 cubic kilometers, 3.0 cubic miles of lava. Floods, ash, and fumes killed 9,000 people and 80% of their livestock. The ensuing starvation killed a quarter of Iceland's population. This period is known as the Mofharfindin mist hardships. When the two kingdoms of Denmark and Norway were separated by the Treaty of Kiel in 1814 following the Napoleonic Wars, Denmark kept Iceland as a dependency. Part 5, Iceland under Norwegian and Danish Kings. Chapter 6, Independence Movement. Throughout the 19th century, the country's climate continued to grow worse, resulting in mass emigration to the New World, particularly Manitoba in Canada. However, a new national consciousness was revived in Iceland, inspired by romantic nationalist ideas from continental Europe. This revival was spearheaded by the Fulnismen, a group of Danish-educated Icelandic intellectuals. An independence movement developed under the leadership of a lawyer named John Sigurðsson. In 1843 a new Althing was founded as a consultative assembly. It claimed continuity with the Althing of the Icelandic Commonwealth, which had remained for centuries as a judicial body and had been abolished in 1800. Part 5, Iceland under Norwegian and Danish Kings. Chapter 7, Home Rule and Sovereignty. In 1874, 1,000 years after the first acknowledged settlement, Denmark granted Iceland a constitution and home rule, which again was expanded in 1904. The constitution was revised in 1903, and a minister for Icelandic affairs, residing in Reykjavik, was made responsible to the Althing, the first of whom was Hannes Hafstein. The Act of Union, December 1, 1918, agreement with Denmark, recognized Iceland as a fully sovereign state. The Kingdom of Iceland joined with Denmark in a personal union with the Danish king. Iceland established its own flag. Denmark was to represent its foreign affairs and defense interests. Iceland had no military or naval forces, and Denmark was to give notice to other countries that it was permanently neutral. The act would be up for revision in 1940 and could be revoked 3 years later if agreement was not reached. By the 1930s the consensus in Iceland was to seek complete independence by 1944 at the latest. Part 5, Iceland under Norwegian and Danish Kings. Chapter 8, World War I. In the quarter of a century preceding the war, Iceland prospered. Iceland became more isolated during World War I and suffered a significant decline in living standards. The treasury became highly indebted, and there was a shortage of food and fears over an imminent famine. Iceland was part of neutral Denmark during the war. Icelanders were, in general, sympathetic to the cause of the Allies. Iceland also traded significantly with the United Kingdom during the war, as Iceland found itself within its sphere of influence. In their attempts to stop the Icelanders from trading with the Germans indirectly, the British imposed costly and time-consuming constraints on Icelandic exports going to the Nordic countries. There is no evidence of any German plans to invade Iceland during the war. 1,245 Icelanders, Icelandic Americans and Icelandic Canadians were registered as soldiers during World War I. 989 fought for Canada, whereas 256 fought for the United States. 391 of the combatants were born in Iceland, the rest were of Icelandic descent. 10 women of Icelandic descent and 4 women born in Iceland served as nurses for the Allies during World War I. At least 144 of the combatants died during World War I. 96 in combat, 19 from wounds suffered during combat, 2 from accidents, and 27 from disease. 61 of them were Iceland-born. 10 men were taken as prisoners of war by the Germans. The war had a lasting impact on Icelandic society and Iceland's external relations. The war led to major government interference in the marketplace that lasted until the post-World War II period. Iceland's competent governance of internal affairs and relations with other states. While relations with Denmark were interrupted during the war, showed that Iceland was capable of acquiring further powers, which resulted in Denmark recognizing Iceland as a fully sovereign state in 1918. It has been argued that the first news of the war helped Morgunblaðið 5 to gain a dominant position among Icelandic newspapers. Part 5, Iceland under Norwegian and Danish Kings. Chapter 9, The Great Depression. Icelandic post-World War I prosperity came to an end with the outbreak of the Great Depression, a severe worldwide economic depression. The depression hit Iceland hard as the value of exports plummeted. The total value of Icelandic exports fell from 74 million króna in 1929 to 48 million króna in 1932, and did not rise again to the pre-1930 level until after 1939. Government interference in the economy increased, imports were regulated, trade with foreign currency was monopolized by state-owned banks, and loan capital was largely distributed by state-regulated funds. The outbreak of the Spanish Civil War cut Iceland's exports of salt fish by half, and the depression lasted in Iceland until the outbreak of World War II, when prices for fish exports soared. Part 5, Iceland under Norwegian and Danish Kings. Chapter 10, World War II. With war looming in spring 1939, Iceland realized its exposed position would be very dangerous in wartime. An all-party government was formed, and Lufthansa's request for civilian airplane landing rights was rejected. German ships were all about, however, until the British blockade of Germany stopped that when the war began in September. Iceland demanded Britain allow it to trade with Germany, to no avail. The occupation of Denmark by Nazi Germany began on the 9th of April 1940, severing communications between Iceland and Denmark. As a result, on the 10th of April, the Parliament of Iceland took temporary control of foreign affairs, setting up what would be the forerunner of the Ministry for Foreign Affairs and the Coast Guard. Parliament also elected a provisional governor, Svein Björnsson, who later became the Republic's first president. Iceland became, de facto, fully sovereign with these actions. At the time, Icelanders and the Danish king considered this state of affairs to be temporary and that Iceland would return these powers to Denmark when the occupation was over. Iceland turned down British offers of protection after the occupation of Denmark, because that would violate Iceland's neutrality. Britain and the US opened direct diplomatic relations, as did Sweden and Norway. The German takeover of Norway left Iceland highly exposed. Britain decided it could not risk a German takeover of Iceland. On the 10th of May 1940, British military forces began an invasion of Iceland when they sailed into Reykjavik harbour in Operation Fork. There was no resistance, but the government protested against what it called a flagrant violation of Icelandic neutrality, and Prime Minister Hermann Jónasson called on Icelanders to treat the British troops with politeness as if they were guests. They behaved accordingly, and there were no mishaps. The occupation of Iceland lasted throughout the war. At the peak, the British had 25,000 troops stationed in Iceland, all but eliminating unemployment in the Reykjavik area and other strategically important places. In July 1941, responsibility for Iceland's occupation and defense passed to the United States under a U.S. Icelandic agreement which included a provision that the U.S. recognize Iceland's absolute independence. The British were replaced by up to 40,000 Americans, who outnumbered all adult Icelandic men. At the time, Iceland had a population of around 120,000. Approximately 159 Icelanders' lives have been confirmed to have been lost in World War II hostilities. Most were killed on cargo and fishing vessels sunk by German aircraft, U-boats or mines. An additional 70 Icelanders died at sea, but it has not been confirmed whether they lost their lives as a result of hostilities. The occupation of Iceland by the British and the American proved to be an economic boon, as the occupiers injected money into the Icelandic economy and launched various projects. This eradicated unemployment in Iceland and raised wages considerably. According to one study, by the end of World War II, Iceland had been transformed from one of Europe's poorest countries to one of the world's wealthiest. Part 6, Republic of Iceland. 1944. Part 6, Republic of Iceland, Chapter 1, Founding of the Republic. On the 31st of December 1943, the Act of Union agreement expired after 25 years. Beginning on the 20th of May 1944, Icelanders voted in a 4-day plebiscite on whether to terminate the personal union with the King of Denmark and establish a republic. The vote was 97% in favor of ending the union and 95% in favor of the new republican constitution. Iceland became an independent republic on the 17th of June 1944, with Svein Björnsson as its first president. Denmark was still occupied by Germany. Danish King Christian X sent a message of congratulations to the Icelandic people. Iceland had prospered during the course of the war, amassing considerable currency reserves in foreign banks. In addition to this, the country received the most martial aid per capita of any European country in the immediate post-war years. At USD 209, with the war-ravaged Netherlands a distant second at USD 109. The new Republican government, led by an unlikely three-party majority cabinet made up of conservatives. The Independence Party, SJALFSTAEFISFLOKKURINN. Social Democrats. The Social Democratic Party, ALFYFUFLOKKURINN. And Socialists. People's Unity Party, Socialist Party, Sosialistaflokkurin, decided to put the funds into a general renovation of the fishing fleet, the building of fish processing facilities, the construction of a cement and fertilizer factory, and a general modernization of agriculture. These actions were aimed at keeping Icelanders' standard of living as high as it had become during the prosperous war years. The government's fiscal policy was strictly Keynesian, and their aim was to create the necessary industrial infrastructure for a prosperous developed country. It was considered essential to keep unemployment down and to protect the export fishing industry through currency manipulation and other means. Because of the country's dependence both on unreliable fish catches and foreign demand for fish products, Iceland's economy remained stable well into the 1990s, when the country's economy was greatly diversified. Part 6, Republic of Iceland Chapter 2, NATO Membership and the Cold War. In October 1946, the Icelandic and United States governments agreed to terminate U.S. responsibility for the defense of Iceland, but the United States retained certain rights at Keflavik, such as the right to re-establish a military presence there, should war threaten. Iceland became a charter member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. NATO. On the 30th of March 1949, with the reservation that it would never take part in offensive action against another nation, the membership came amid an anti-NATO riot in Iceland. After the outbreak of the Korean War in 1950, and pursuant to the request of NATO military authorities, the United States and Iceland agreed that the United States should again take responsibility for Iceland's defense. This agreement, signed on the 5th of May 1951, was the authority for the controversial U.S. military presence in Iceland, which remained until 2006. The U.S. base served as a hub for transports and communications to Europe, a key chain in the GI-UK gap, a monitor of Soviet submarine activity, a linchpin in the early warning system for incoming Soviet attacks and interceptor of Soviet reconnaissance bombers. Although U.S. forces no longer maintain a military presence in Iceland, the U.S. still assumes responsibility over the country's defense through NATO. Iceland has retained strong ties to the other Nordic countries. As a consequence, Norway, Denmark, Germany and other European nations have increased their defense and rescue cooperation with Iceland since the withdrawal of U.S. forces. Part 6, Republic of Iceland Chapter 3, Cod Wars. The Cod Wars were a series of militarized interstate disputes between Iceland and the United Kingdom from the 1950s to the mid-1970s. The Proto-Cod War, 1952 to 1956, revolved around Iceland's extension of its fishery limits from 3 to 4 nautical miles. The First Cod War, 1958 to 1961, was fought over Iceland's extension from 4 to 12 nautical miles, 7 to 22 kilometers. The Second Cod War, 1972 to 1973, occurred when Iceland extended the limits to 50 miles, 93 kilometers. The Third Cod War, 1975 to 1976, was fought over Iceland's extension of its fishery limits to 200 miles, 370 kilometers. Icelandic patrol ships and British trawlers clashed in all 4 Cod Wars. The Royal Navy was sent to the contested waters in the last 3 Cod Wars, leading to highly publicized clashes. During these disputes, Iceland threatened closure of the US base at Keflavik and the withdrawal of its NATO membership. Because of Iceland's strategic importance during the Cold War, it was important for the US and NATO to maintain the base on Icelandic soil and to keep Iceland as a member of NATO. While the Icelandic government did go through on its threat to break off diplomatic relations with the UK during the Third Cod War, it never went through on its threats to close the US base or to withdraw from NATO. It is rare for militarized interstate disputes of this magnitude and intensity to occur between 2 democracies with as close economic, cultural and institutional ties as Iceland and the UK. Part 6, Republic of Iceland Chapter 4, EEA Membership and Economic Reform. In 1991, the Independence Party, led by Davi Frodson, formed a coalition government with the Social Democrats. This government set in motion market liberalization policies, privatizing a number of state-owned companies. Iceland then became a member of the European Economic Area in 1994. Economic stability increased and previously chronic inflation was drastically reduced. In 1995, the Independence Party formed a coalition government with the Progressive Party. This government continued with free market policies, privatizing to commercial banks and the state-owned telecom Landsíminn. Corporate income tax was reduced to 18%, from around 50% at the beginning of the decade. Inheritance tax was greatly reduced and the net wealth tax was abolished. A system of individual transferable quotas in the Icelandic fisheries, first introduced in the late 1970s, was further developed. The coalition government remained in power through elections in 1999 and 2003. In 2004, Davi Frodson stepped down as Prime Minister after 13 years in office. Hildur Grímsson, leader of the Progressive Party, took over as Prime Minister from 2004 to 2006, followed by Geir Ragnar, Davi Frodson's successor as leader of the Independence Party. Following a recession in the early 1990s, economic growth was considerable, averaging about 4% per year from 1994. The governments of the 1990s and 2000s adhered to a staunch but domestically controversial pro-US foreign policy, lending nominal support to the NATO action in the Kosovo War and signing up as a member of the Coalition of the Willing during the 2003 invasion of Iraq. In March 2006, the United States announced that it intended to withdraw the greater part of the Icelandic Defense Force. On the 12th of August 2006, the last 4 F-15s left Icelandic airspace. The United States closed the Keflavik Air Base in September 2006. In 2016, it was reported that the United States considered reopening the base. Following elections in May 2007, the Independence Party, headed by Geir Ragnar, remained in government, albeit in a new coalition with the Social Democratic Alliance. Part 6, Republic of Iceland Chapter 5, Financial Crisis. In October 2008, the Icelandic banking system collapsed, prompting Iceland to seek large loans from the International Monetary Fund and friendly countries. Widespread protests in late 2008 and early 2009 resulted in the resignation of the government of Geir Ragnar, which was replaced on the 1st of February 2009 by a coalition government led by the Social Democratic Alliance and the Left Green Movement. Social Democrat Minister Johanna Sigur Fæadóttir was appointed Prime Minister, becoming the world's first openly homosexual head of government of the modern era. Elections took place in April 2009, and a continuing coalition government consisting of the Social Democrats and the Left Green Movement was established in May 2009. The crisis resulted in the greatest migration from Iceland since 1887, with a net emigration of 5,000 people in 2009. Iceland's economy stabilized under the government of Johanna Sigur Fæadóttir and grew by 1.6% in 2012, but many Icelanders remained unhappy with the state of the economy and government austerity policies. The centre-right Independence Party was returned to power, in coalition with the Progressive Party, in the 2013 elections. On the 1st of August 2016, Guðnlaugsson Jóhannesson became the new president of Iceland. Part 7. Historiography. Part 7. Historiography. Chapter 1. Division of history into named periods. While it is convenient to divide history into named periods, it is also misleading because the course of human events neither starts nor ends abruptly in most cases, and movements and influences often overlap. One period, as Gunnar Karlsson describes, can be considered the period from 930 CE to 1262 to 1264, when there was no central government or leader, political power being characterized by chieftains. Geofare. This period is referred to therefore as the Fjöldisold or Geofavldisold, national or chieftain state period by Icelandic authors, and the Old Commonwealth or Free State by English ones. There is little consensus on how to divide Icelandic history. Gunnar's own book, A Brief History of Iceland, 2010, has 33 chapters with considerable overlap in dates. John J. A. Files, 1915 text, Islandaga, A History of Iceland, uses 10 periods. Landnam sold. Settlement age. c. 870 to 930. Sogaold. Saga age. 930-1030. Íslenska kirkjan Elstutíð. The early Icelandic church. 1030 to 1152. Sturlungaold. Sturlung age. 1152 to 1262. Island und Erstjorn Norwegskan uppgang och Kennymanna. Norwegian royal rule and the rise of the clergy. 1262 to 1400. Kirkjuvald. Ecclesiastical power. 1400 to 1550. Konungsvald. Royal authority. 1550 to 1683. Einveldioginoken. Absolutism and monopoly trading. 1683 to 1800. Isnarbatta. Campaign for restoration of past glories 1801 to 1874. Framson. Progress. 1875 to 1915. In another of Gunnar's books, Iceland's 1100 Years. 2000. Icelandic history is divided into 4 periods. Colonization and Commonwealth c. 870-1262. Under foreign rule 1262 c. 1800. A primitive society builds a state 1809 to 1918. The Great 20th Century Transformation, based mainly on forms of government, except for the last which reflects mechanization of the fishing industry. This recording is a derivative work from Wikipedia. For more information, please visit www.frogcast.org.